Iran bargains the suffering of millions of Yemenis to secure gains in nuclear program negotiations. In a new war crime, Houthi militia attacks populated areas in Harad city with ballistic missiles. Houthi killing machine targets journalists and assaults freedom of speech. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Rana Swalem. The United Nations said that it will reduce its aid provided in Yemen due to a lack of funding. The United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs confirmed that it will soon have to reduce the volume of food aid provided in Yemen to 11 million people. The office added that further reduction in the volume of aid is expected unless funding is received urgently. The United Nations Refugee Agency in Yemen said around 1.6 million Yemenis live in over 2,300 housing sites across the country. It said that about 7 million people need shelter services, adding that the organization's teams provide locally made materials to help Yemenis build their homes. Peace in Yemen is swinging between powers inside and outside the country. Inside Yemen, peace depends on the battles that are raging on the ground. As for outside powers, Iran gives support to the Houthi rebels to continue their onslaught, and this will give Tehran a say in the future of peace. More on the Iranian involvement in Yemen is within the following report.
Since the beginning of Yemeni's civil war in 2014, peace seems no closer today than it did 8 years ago. In fact, after taking office last year, U.S. President Joe Biden called the war in Yemen a humanitarian and a strategic catastrophe. Yet fighting continues, and the humanitarian situation remains dire as funding shortages force cuts in emergency assistance and civilians navigate the threats of Houthi landmines and escalating fighting. The situation, however, widens bit by bit by overreaching other countries outside Yemen, especially after Houthi strikes in Saudi Arabia and UAE. This new episode of conflict ushered the region in a state of prolonged uncertainty and instability. Iran, in turn, plays an important role in Yemeni and regional equation. By transferring long-range capabilities to the Houthis, Iran has used Yemen as a staging ground to pressure other countries in the region and to gain a hand in its own yet unsolved nuclear crisis with the West. Over the years, Iran has cultivated the Houthi movement as a key partner. The Houthi rebels have developed deeper ties with Tehran through support from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard and other Iranian-backed groups across the Middle East, most notably Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Houthis' socio-political, military, and strategic outlook has aligned more closely with Iran from that moment. The latter, in turn, apply constant strategic military pressure throughout the southern Arabian Peninsula. The Iranian support to the Houthis has significantly altered the group's military capabilities. It allowed them to build an arsenal that includes ballistic missiles and one-way attack drones. The tragedy of Yemen was written firstly by the Houthi rebellion. It, however, exceeded the Yemeni soil and overspilled on the whole region. According to experts, the Yemeni issue has three solutions within hand currently. The first of which is a complete defeat of the Houthi Iranian arm, or a reconciliation and a building of an inclusive peace. Otherwise, the Yemeni future will depend on a far unrealistic political compromise between regional players, including Iran.
French Agency for Press reported that Houthi leaders admitted that 15,000 of their militants have been killed in 5 months in the battles of Ma'rib last year. The agency added also that 56 members of the Houthi militia were killed during the past 3 days in confrontations with the government forces in the border city of Harad. To that end, a military source said that 30 Houthi militants were killed and a vehicle was destroyed along with an ammunition storehouse in battles around Harad. This comes while the government forces continued clearing the city that was liberated from the rebels 3 days ago. The government forces shut down Houthi attempts at crossing the center of Harad and destroyed 8 Houthi drones. Military sources said that scores of Houthi militants were killed during fighting and airstrikes by the coalition in the city. Still in Hajjah, the coalition announced that the Houthi rebels have launched 7 ballistic missiles. It said in a statement that the 4 ballistic missiles were launched from the city of Hodeidah and Sana'a International Airport, while other 3 missiles targeted civilians. To that end, the coalition said it carried out 15 operations in Hajjah against the Houthi militia. The air raids destroyed 8 military vehicles and killed a number of Houthi militants. Coalition aircraft and government forces artillery targeted Houthi militia sites and gatherings in the northwestern France of Ma'rib. Military sources indicated that the strikes inflicted heavy human and material losses on the rebels. The International Federation of Journalists and the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate launched an emergency call to put pressure on the Houthi rebels to release 9 journalists. IFJ said that the journalists were arrested for their reporting on human rights violations committed by Houthi militia. The following report has more on that.
Media rights groups have asked Yemen's Houthi rebels to release 4 journalists convicted to death for espionage in the war-torn nation. The Houthis, backed by Iran, took over Sana'a from the internationally recognized government in 2014, igniting a civil war that has destroyed the already destitute country. In 2015, a group of 10 journalists were abducted by the Houthis during a raid in the capital Sana'a. The Houthis sentenced the journalists to death for their alleged collaboration with the Arab coalition. During a prisoner swap between the Houthis and the government in 2020, 6 journalists were released, while the remaining journalists, Abdul Khaliq Amran, Tawfiq al-Mansouri, Harith Hamid, and Akram al-Walidi, were sentenced to death on allegations of treason and espionage, a verdict that Yemen's government opposed at the time. The journalists were reportedly thrown into solitary confinement, denied life-saving medical treatment, and banned from contacting their families. The International Federation of Journalists and the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate said that the journalists' arrest was motivated by their reporting on human rights violations committed by the Houthi forces. The 2 groups announced they were hosting an emergency call to exert pressure on the Houthi leadership to liberate the journalists and preserve their lives. The International Federation of Journalists, which stands for the journalists and unions of over 140 countries, said the 4 captured journalists had suffered physical and psychological torture, and the denial of the right to be visited and the right to have access to medical care. Amnesty International denounced their imprisonment on trumped-up charges at the time of their trial, while the Reporters Without Borders declared the conviction totally unacceptable. Hundreds of thousands have been murdered and millions have been displaced as a result of Yemen's conflict, which the United Nations has termed the world's greatest humanitarian crisis.
Journalists are often perceived as a part of a conflict rather than civilian observers. As a result, they experience barely any protection in their coverage of stories. Yemen ranks 169 out of 180 on Reporters Without Borders press freedom rankings. Human rights organizations find these rankings alarming and are exerting pressure on the appropriate parties to amend the situation. More on this is in the following report.
The year 2021 turned its record and many violations were committed against journalists in Yemen, which amounted to 104 cases of violations affecting media outlets, journalists, and photographers, and the looting of their possessions since the beginning of January until the end of December of the same year. The Houthi areas represented in the first place an unsafe and more hostile environment for journalists, according to the statement of the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate in the annual report on media freedom. The violations were distributed among 30 cases of freedom detention, 19 cases of prevention and confiscation of journalists and their belongings, 12 cases of threats and incitement, 12 cases of trial, 11 cases of assault, 6 cases of depriving detained journalists from the right to medical care, 5 cases of torture, 5 cases of suspension of media and journalist entitlements, and 4 cases of murder. The Houthis alone committed 46 cases of violations out of the total violations, while other parties committed the rest against journalists, and there are still 14 journalists detained by different parties, including 12 journalists with the Houthi group, some of whom the group issued unfair sentences to death. With regard to prevention and confiscation, the syndicate recorded 19 cases, including 10 cases of prevention of press coverage, 4 cases of banning from visiting the kidnapped journalists, 3 cases of confiscation of photojournalist cameras, 2 confiscation of journalist cars, 6 cases of deprivation of the abductees from the right to health care, and 5 cases of torture of abductees. Many journalists and foreign media correspondents complain about the restrictions imposed by the Houthi militia on journalistic work, through illegal internal regulations that impose restrictions, control, and sums of money on media work, in light of continuous calls to save the press and journalists in Yemen, and to stop the policies practiced by the terrorist group to target the press and journalists' respect for freedom of opinion and expression. Journalists are suffering in Yemen due to Houthi violations. They are being deprived from the right of living a decent life, and no one knows when will that end.
A human rights organization revealed that more than 1,000 Africans of Ethiopian nationality are fighting in the ranks of the Houthi militia. The organization pointed out that about 30 Ethiopian migrants who arrived in Yemen went to Sada Governorate. They were arrested by the Houthi militia, who threatened them to fight in their ranks. Coming next. Crushed by atrocities of war, some Yemenis sell their organs to survive hard living conditions.
اضطرينا نحن نغادر من ذي وزحنا.
الله يستنقذكم يا محويتني الله يستنقذ.
Welcome back. The war and the deteriorating economic conditions have forced many families to surrender to a tragic reality, in which they get by on the cash earned from selling their property. Some families were even forced to let go of their kidneys to face the crisis that have wormed their way into their homes. More details on this are in the following report.
Mujahid Muhammad, a Yemeni citizen, the war left him nothing in his life, only his kidneys were left, which he is now offering for sale. This was the final decision of Mujahid after living desperately in poverty, facing the living crisis and obtaining housing for him and his 6 children. His decision was to sell one of his kidneys as if it has been destined for this family to eat and drink from the flesh, blood and tears of their father.
If I find anyone to buy my kidney, I'm ready to sell it immediately at any time. I have reached a dead end. We don't have any life necessities, and I cannot afford to feed my children. We don't have rice, sugar or oil, nothing. My life turned into darkness and hell. I have no hope left. I don't have any family inside or outside Yemen. There is no one to help me. through this time.
The citizen Mujahid Muhammad took this house for rent after leaving his home in El Zanouj area to escape from the Houthi death shells. Here, the old and the young share hunger, thirst, cold, rain, heat of the sun, even darkness, and the harshness of life and many requirements that the father is unable to provide amid years of war, displacement, and homelessness.
أنا لي نازح حوالي من أول الحرب من الجماعة القضائي من أول توفير لقمة العيش أو
I have been displaced since the beginning of the war. I came here trying to afford food to my children and provide for my family. My girls are in high school and they cannot even pay transportation to their schools. They go to their schools early in the morning without having breakfast and come in the afternoon having nothing to eat. They feel depressed and embarrassed all the time.
The situation was narrowed by this family, whose young children were ravaged by famine, to force the father to do what he did not expect to do in life, even it was that miserable. Yemeni citizens continue to suffer during the war, facing poverty, displacement, and homelessness. With nothing in their hands to do, they are ready to do anything now to ease the suffering of their children and their families.
Local sources in Raima Governorate, Western Yemen, said the Houthi militia's levies on students prompted one of the students to commit suicide. The student Zakaria Al-Saidi committed suicide after failing to pay the monthly fees for admission to school. Sources indicated that the militias imposed a monthly fee of 2,000 riyals upon each student in the name of community participation. According to sources, some of the royalties go to the militia leaders, while the rest are allocated towards financing the Houthi war on the Yemeni people. The oil and domestic gas crisis in Aden revived the black market after oil derivatives disappeared from state-owned and private stations. Dozens of vehicles were stopped and most of the citizens' work was disrupted as a result of the suffocating crisis. Citizens in Aden called upon officials to place serious and urgent solutions to alleviate their suffering in light of the deteriorating living and economic conditions. The internet service was cut off in the governorates of Ma'rib and Hadramaut, northeast of Yemen. Engineers said that the internet service was cut off due to a cut in a cable providing the service in eastern Yemen. Despite the considerable cash collected by the Cleaning and Improvement Fund, the city of Ja'ar in Abyan Governorate is experiencing a dreadful environmental scenario due to rubbish littering the city's streets and neighborhoods. This report has more details.
The city of Ja'ar in Abyan Governorate is going through a miserable environmental situation due to the increase of garbage in the streets and neighborhoods of the city. Despite the enormous income received by the Cleaning and Improvement Fund, there are no significant touches. As soon as you stand at the entrance of the city of Ja'ar, you will see the rubbish piled on top of each other, turning the city into a garbage complex.
About the hygiene in Ja'ar, there is no hygiene in the city. We don't even have trash cans. So people throw their waste on the floor. Ja'ar is a big city and it needs care and sanitation.
The population witnessed non-existent services, perhaps the most prominent of which are hygiene services that you see crowded on every side. This causes a threat to exacerbate the suffering of the people, which has become a major dilemma for citizens and visitors.
The trash is everywhere. That would cause health problem and the authorities are not providing any trash cans. So people throw their waste everywhere. This affects the society badly. So we call on authorities to help us find a solution.
The problem of poor hygiene that the city of Ja'ar lives is a problem that worries everyone, from causing irreversible environmental and health risks and damages. This is what makes the citizens here continue their appeals and messages to the concerned authorities to look into this matter and sense responsibility and work to activate an executive mechanism to preserve the hygiene of the city and the health of its children.
The National Committee Against Coronavirus recorded 26 new cases of the pandemic. Committee officials said 14 recovered cases and 2 deaths were recorded. With the current updates, total confirmed cases are 11,579, including 2,090 deaths and 8,369 cases of recovery. Here's a reminder of the main headlines. Iran bargains the suffering of millions of Yemenis to secure gains in nuclear program negotiations. In a new war crime, Houthi militia attacks populated areas in Harad city with ballistic missiles. Houthi killing machine targets journalists and assaults freedom of speech. This is the end of the news. For more, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at Yemen Today English. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.